Hi, my name is Alex Eswayat. I serve as one of the assistant directors in the Center for Multicultural Affairs here at Duke. Today with me I'm sitting with the Reverend Dr. William Turner. He is both a Duke alumni as well as one of the most prominent folks in our Office of Black Affairs to Center for Multicultural Affairs History, and it is wonderful to sit with you today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Greetings to you.
One of the first things I want to ask is just how did you come into relationship with what is now our Center for Multicultural Affairs?
I suppose it would have to start with maybe a bit of history. I came into the office, it was called the Office of Black Affairs. I came into that office, I was recruited. I had just finished a year as campus minister at A&T. That's what I had done. But I had gone there after having spent 4 years as an undergraduate in the School of Engineering and 3 years in the Divinity School. And for a year I'd served there at A&T as campus minister, and they were trying to fill the deanship, that's what they call it, the Dean of Black Affairs office. After a year in which C.G. Newsom, who had, like me, been an undergraduate and a divinity student, had served as, I believe he served as acting dean, I believe it was. And he had served after the departure of Harold Wallace, who was the first dean, the Dean of Black Affairs. And so I was recruited to take the permanent position of assistant provost and Dean of Black Affairs. Yeah.
Well, as I hear you talking about the history, I hear a few different names, some of which are familiar, some of which are new to me, and I recognize that there are probably some prominent figures that sometimes get left out, and so I want to ask you about some of the names that I had heard. I heard you mention Harold Wallace, as well as I've seen Caroline Gray's name come up, and so, or Carolyn Gray, excuse me, and so I wasn't sure if those folks had any involvement in maybe the origins of the Office of Black Affairs or how it evolved.
Oh, I would say the one with the most involvement would have been Harold Wallace. Harold had been a divinity student. He had finished in, had graduated from divinity school, but while he was still a student, he was brought on as an assistant to the dean. Yes, and this was an effort to address issues that were raised in the university during the years of intense conflict and struggle. 1968 and 1969 in particular. 68 is the year that was where there was, following the assassination of Martin Luther King, there was some intense upheaval and uproar on the campus. And one of the main issues, two of the main issues were pay for non-academic employees, and there was and had been a groundswell of petition and movement and protest for Black studies. The question was, what was the university going to do about Black studies, but also what was the university going to do about the tensions that were rising with the admittance of African American students, but no adjustments on the university to accommodate their presence. So there had been sit-ins, and there had been protests, and there had been all kinds of acts, during the preceding years. And so the assistant to the dean, which Wallace was first, was an attempt to move in that direction. But then after that, there was more movement that was needed as well. Now, I might add that Wallace went on to over 30 years as a distinguished administrator at UNC.
Oh.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
I'm sure that's controversial.
Well, it depends on who you're talking to.
Depends who you talk to.
Who you're talking to.
So as you name some of those years, we can't have this conversation without naming the Allen Building takeover, right? So I'm curious about what the campus climate was like during that time as someone who was there, as well as how that led to the creation or maybe the push for Office of Black Affairs.
Well, the climate during those early years, I do not know the good words to use to describe it. It was tensive. It was restive. What Duke had done was bring in black students, African American students, mostly, almost entirely, hardly without an exception, from the South. High achieving students from Southern high schools, and some were from boarding schools, but mostly from public schools, from a segregated school system in which blacks and whites had no contact. Oh no. And so, for the most part, the students who were here, both black and white, were Southerners who had had no social contact with one another before coming. And so the white students didn't know the world of the black students. The black students didn't know the world of the white students. I would say that probably one of the greatest spots of ignorance, and this may be true of the general culture as well, was not knowing how black students had been cultivated and nurtured. We were class presidents, valedictorians. Oh my goodness, we had the best of teachers. In some of the school systems in the South, the best trained best trained teachers were the black teachers, because salaries were set based on education. And there were teachers in the school systems, in the segregated systems all over the South, who had their master's degrees and some with their PhDs, because some states would actually pay the black teacher, the black public school teacher they would pay for them to leave the state and do graduate study in New York, Chicago, or wherever, at the expense of the state, rather than to integrate the schools. Rather than to integrate the colleges and universities in the South, they would pay these teachers. They'd pay their way. There were persons even with medical degrees that were earned at the expense of the state of North Carolina because they left North Carolina rather than force the integration issue in North Carolina. So these are some of the inconsistencies and contradictions that existed in the pre-civil rights South. Let me give you just one example of what I'm talking about. When I talk about the way that many of us were developed in the public school systems in the South. If you watched the movie Hidden Figures,
Yes, sir.
you see how the math teacher developed this woman who became what was known as a human computer. Well, that was a practice that had taken place, that occurred all over the South. Within the segregated school systems, there were these competitions and contests in math and science, where teachers spent their own time and sometimes even their own money to cultivate students who had great promise. And so the attitude within the segregated Southern school system was that things were going to change, and that when they did change, there would be a crop of students who had been cultivated and developed and ready to send to the institutions in the South. You know, even when they weren't sent to these institutions, they went to the HBCUs and had high achievement and great success because of the devotion and dedication of these teachers. So the incongruity, the conflict, the tension was that as undergraduates, we were in the hands of and being handled by many, many, many faculty members who had no idea of who we were and how we'd been cultivated and how we saw ourselves, which made for tension, friction. During those days, we cultivated a life in the city of Durham, in Hayti, Pettigrew Street, North Carolina College. It was not North Carolina Central University then. It was still North Carolina College. But we would go to North Carolina College for social life, and even in some cases for academic life.
But it was a whole other world.
It was going into another world. My father told me, he was from North Carolina, his home was North Carolina. He told me, when he brought me here, he said, son, find your people. Find your people. And that's what we did. We found our people. We found our people in the dining halls, in the residence halls. For the men, the housekeepers, they took it, they treated us just like, what shall we say, like the sons of little masters. They cleaned up behind us, they made up our beds. Now, women didn't get that kind of treatment, but men did. But they also took us to church. They prayed over us, they counseled us. The housekeepers. They were like our parents. They were like parents to us. Housekeepers, workers in the cafeteria, in the serving line. Well, and so what happened was attention just kept building over those first few years. Attention between the world that we found in Durham and the world that we endured had due. And the other point to be made was that there was a larger world, the world of the civil rights movement, the Black Power era, the cultural renaissance that was taking place, that was reaching back to, what shall we say, to the Renaissance that occurred in the 20s and the Harlem Renaissance, the Renaissance in literary production, movies. We were not in a cultural vacuum, and the only cultural world we knew was not the one that was offered to us by Duke. And so tensions emerged and mounted, and the first big spill was in 1968, the vigil following the assassination of King, and then in 1969 with the building takeover. But sometimes it's misunderstood as if one outburst and protest was placid and calm and serene, and the other was like a volcano. But no, there is a continuum. There is a continuum, both within and without the university. But also the restiveness. There had been restiveness on the part of students, even to bring the admission of African Americans in 1963. There had been contests and struggles within the university, within the student body and the faculty to precede all of that. Yeah.
It's never just a singular event, ever. It makes me think about when we talk about multiculturalism and we talk about how to support students here, we often frame it as though this institution, all higher education institutions, are a microcosm of what's out there. It's not, that's the real world and this isn't. And that's one of the things I remember hearing in college, and I constantly was like, no, this is also the real world. But in a lot of ways, it's almost a training ground. And a lot of the students who are considered marginalized, it almost feels as though learning almost trial by fire is a rite of passage, and it really shouldn't be that way. And so one of the things that I was wondering in preparing to speak with you today was, though the roots are in Black affairs and we've gotten to see the birth of the Mary Lou and the birth of minority affairs into intercultural, into multicultural affairs, what does the relationship between all marginalized students look like to you? What is a healthy or a coalition-centered relationship look like to you?
Well, let me back up a step from that, if I may, because initially the academic and the cultural were woven together in the protests. I mean, we knew there was more to study than we were being presented. Oh yes, oh yes. I mean, this contest that's coming to the surface, and what shall we say, and bubbling up and simmering all over the country now about what scholarship ought to be and ought to look like. That is not new. That is not new. As African Americans, we had read, we had studied, we had learned, we had been informed by our teachers of, what shall I say, of the critical tradition in American and U.S. scholarship that was produced by African Americans and other critical persons. We were aware of it and were concerned that we may be, what shall I say, miseducated. Carter G. Woodson wrote a book early in the 20th century, The Miseducation of the Negro. And we were concerned that we were being miseducated. We were aware of the professors and of the scholarship that existed across town at North Carolina College. Some of the students who were here, their parents had been students at North Carolina College. I mean, we were aware of the HBCU, tradition of scholarship. We were aware of it. And it was not sufficient to be fed the bland diet being offered here at Duke, because we knew that when we left, we would be going into a world that would expect us to be conversant and give leadership in a broader field of study. So the cultural and academic pieces were really kind of interwoven from the outset, you know? And it was only in time that the separation took place. And it was with the Office of Black Affairs, but alongside the Office of Black Affairs was the quest for Black Studies. They went like, what shall I say, the left hand and the right hand, the hand and glove. Now, I cannot say that I know with clarity and certainty what that struggle was for other students who were not born in the U.S. Or whose cultural and educational roots went elsewhere. Because you were expected during those days to fall in line. Just fall in line and you'll be okay. It was not quite as difficult to do that if you were in what was called the natural sciences, the hard sciences, physics, math, and I might say that I was an engineer, and so the issues were not as sharp in engineering studies, but part of your education at Duke required taking courses in the human sciences, the natural sciences, the human sciences, and there was a third component in the curriculum, free electives, yes. And so, you know, in engineering courses, physics courses, chemistry courses, you just put your nose down and did the work of that discipline. Mm-hmm. But then, when it came to the human sciences, this is when these other issues become extremely important as you get to the interrogation of knowledges and the testing of ideas and approaches, and when you begin to learn in a thicker way what it means to be human and to be prepared to lead.
So I guess another way that I start to think is, and I actually had this conversation with Dr. Lattimore where, you know, there's not a robust status of some of these other communities that were considered marginalized because of some of, I think, the push-pull that I'm hearing from you. And so part of my wondering leans towards when the office sort of evolved into minority affairs, and then there was the birth of the LU. I remember asking about, you know, how did minority affairs articulate who they served? And Dr. Lattimore shared that those students were very used to existing in pockets, and they held celebration, and folks would go, but they would really only do light touch points with minority affairs. And it almost feels like that evolved over time into a space where students felt like that was the only way. And so in your opinion, how can students, Black, Latinx, Asian American, Pacific Islander, and so on, how would you advise them in creating community with one another while maintaining that individual community appreciation?
Yeah. I think the honest answer for me is, I don't know.
That's fair.
The whole time, the whole while that I was here as Assistant Provost and Dean of Black Affairs, that's what it was. It was not Minority Affairs, Intercultural Affairs. And we worked right at that intersection of academic challenge, the academic challenge that Black students, African American students faced. We worked at the intersection of the academic challenge and also the social outlet that they saw. Now, having said that, there was never any rejection of others, other minorities, if you will, who could make common cause with what we did that was designed for African American students. The academic component in that office during the time I was there focused largely, almost entirely, on math and English. That's where we focused. And we made common cause with the English faculty and the math faculty, and provided all kinds of enhancement, enrichment, and work in these areas. It was not shut off or cut off from anybody, but it was clearly identified so that the Black students would know this is a place where you can come if you have need of our assistance. Mm-hmm. Now, in years to come, and I think the transition from Black affairs to minority affairs, and even into cultural affairs, I think those transitions, they came after I had exited. Yes. And I might add, you know, for a time, for a long time, I had a similar assignment and portfolio within the divinity school.
Oh yeah.
Oh yes, and it's also interesting how those intersections developed. Yeah.
Because of your long-standing relationship with the institution, whether it was through the divinity side or teaching or being a student and everything in between, what advice would you give Duke, which is very broad, I get, in supporting these marginalized students, either now or in years to come as we pursue another 50 years?
Yeah. I suppose I would say, first and foremost, learn to listen. And that is not always the easiest task for people who already know. But you have to listen to what students tell you, to what students say, to what students cry. Learn how to magnify the silences that tear people apart. Learn how to do it. And then address the needs as you learn them from the silences, from the tears, and from the angst. The trigger point, one of the greatest triggers, one of the great triggers in the early days, and this was just before the creation of the Office of Black Affairs. The great trigger was I'm trying to get straight exactly what year it was, when, and just an enormous percentage of the students, of the black students who had been admitted in the fall, flunked out after their first semester. And that's when we said, oh, something is wrong. Something's wrong. You did not make all these mistakes when you admitted them. Something is wrong. Now, the question becomes, when you have that high rate of attrition, do you put all of the blame on the student? Or do you share some of the blame as the institution? Did you make that many mistakes? In admitting your class? No. There is something else going on here that must be addressed. And that's when we really started pushing for advising, counseling, tutoring, support. Oh, yeah. That's when I think we identified it during that period and they're developed into what we call the STP program, the Summer Transitional Program. Bring the students here during the summer, before their first semester. I'll give them a chance to get adjusted to the place, to the environment, to the pace at which they will have to work, to the way they will be taught, to what will be expected of them. Yeah, and there, I think you can probably find some of the founding documents for the STP program, the Summer Transitional Program.
I found some beautiful photos.
Yes.
And they didn't have captions, so you saying that, it's
Yeah.
really wonderful.
But the focus was math and English. Yeah. To retain some of these people whom you admitted.
Yeah.
If you simply admit them, keep them for a semester, chew them out, chew them up, spit them out, you may have damaged their lives. And during those days, oh my goodness, for a male student, to be terminated, it was a death sentence. As soon as you got dismissed, you got your draft letter.
Oh my goodness.
Yes, these were the days of Vietnam. I remember those days. I remember those days because when I got here, shortly after I got here on campus in 1966, I got a letter from my draft board reclassifying me to 1A. I had been classified 4F. I had a medical condition, a knee. But lo and behold, when I went to the dean's office, I found that there was another student in there from the same draft board with the same problem. But the draft board was like almost like a vulture hovering, waiting for a student to punch out, as we said, to flunk out of school. And scoop!
So what I'm hearing is a multiplicity of pressures.
Pressures.
On top of pressure, on top of pressure. I want to ask you a little bit about our theme, in your opinion. I feel like it was shared prior, but I want to reiterate it. So when our physical Center for Multicultural Affairs was moved, our fearless director, Linda Capers, would answer folks with grace and with tact, and every time somebody wanted to drum something up, it's we were there and now we're here. We were there and now we're here. It's about how we move forward. We're not about all that mess. It's how can we support the students in the best possible way from a place of intention and care, right? So we built that theme. We were there and now we're here, redefining our center. And so when you hear the term redefine our center, we talk about it in both the physical sense, the physical center, redefining what that is, but also what it means to fortify your sense of self and what that means in larger community, whether it's chosen community or community that comes with choosing to be at Duke for whatever the reason. So what does redefining a center mean to you?
To me, redefining a center means looking closely, seriously, inspecting the times, listening to the students, and developing sensitivity to the needs, looking at the times, the scenes, the situations on the ground as it is. Not as you wish it was, as you want it to be, not even as it was then necessarily. I mean, you know, one of the worst conversations that I can have with young African Americans is one in which I expect them to know how I felt, how we felt coming out of the pre-civil rights era and the segregated school system. Yeah? So you got to pay attention to where people are coming from and to what they are confronting and to what they are poised to enter. Hopefully some good studies are being done, you know. But the university, the faculty, the administrators, also need to become keen on cultural intelligence. In other words, what is there about the school's culture? What cultural intelligence does Duke need to have of itself? What are you saying and doing? What is loaded into the words, the phrases, the constructions, the configurations that you are not even aware of?
The optics
Ah,
that you choose.
you're unaware of it. But it strikes an other with force. What you say, how you present yourself, what you do. And you do not even realize what you have done. And if I could diverge here, and you can eliminate this if you want to. But I think that is what is so serious and seriously wrong with the opposition that is being put now against critical thinking and critical thought. Everything about life in the U.S. has not been pretty. And all that is not pretty has not gone away. In some cases, it has taken on another guise, another form. It has been tucked into languages, into idioms, into values, at places where it is scarcely seen. And so I think there is a cultural intelligence that the university needs to have. And some of the programs and approaches and responses that need to be made need to grow out of those ventures into cultural intelligence. And let's make an example, just give an example. I don't know how many people had even noticed. The Confederate generals and the statues of Confederate generals that were at the entrance to the chapel until the issue arose in Charlottesville. And when they moved, Robert E. Lee, when they moved the Confederate generals, they really had to do it at night and by stealth, really, you might say, to make sure that they did not stir up what they didn't want. But for years and years, people have been coming into the chapel, not even knowing who the patrons were. Yeah. And that's just an example of how something, an act, a statement, a configuration, a program that is utterly repulsive and reprehensible can be hiding in the cultural practices.
Like coding.
No.
It's a part of it.
And
the buildings on the first year campus that recently got covered and renamed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. The participation of some of our cherished heroes in despicable behavior. Yeah. But also in practices, in gestures, in language, in words that are thought to be or presumed to be innocent, but highly offensive. I'll just give you an example. This is from back during my undergraduate days, when black students put up such a protest against the playing of Dixie.
Oh my goodness.
At sports events. Yeah. And we were told, oh, it doesn't mean anything to us. But our response was, if it means nothing to you, why can't you quit it?
It means something to someone.
There was passion. There was passion around holding on to it. And I will never forget the football game when black students burned a Confederate flag down in the stadium. And one man just went into the flames and wrapped himself in the flag as it was burning. But it means nothing to us. Surely it means something to you. Listen to the people who tell you there is a meaning that is offensive. And that's just an example. But I'm talking now more broadly about what cultural intelligence is.
But it all relates to the same categorical problem and solution. And I think it all matters to this concept of how do centers like ours, multicultural diversity, equity, inclusion entities, take history and use it to better inform how we move forward. Sure. And so I do want to ask my last question, which is, how would you advise students, or really communities of color at large, because there are staff and faculty alike, right? How do you advise these folks in persistence and moving forward?
Well, I would say choose the issues deliberately and intentionally, insofar as possible. Do not simply stumble into an issue. choose issues deliberately and intentionally, strategically, deliberately, and in the quest for cultural intelligence, be sure to listen to someone other than yourself. Yeah. Be sure to listen to someone other than yourself. And thirdly, to the best of your ability, do all you can out of a generosity of spirit. And that is more than trying to be nice. Because when you try to be nice, if that's your only lodestar, what you call nice just might not be so nice. Yeah. We're nice to our pets. Yeah. Yeah. But we're not treating them as those who can really tell us what we need to hear. Mm-hmm.
Is there anything else that you want to leave us with?
I don't know. What should I call it like an old tea model? Forward, you crank me up and I can start talking. I've talked about, what shall I say, a portion of my time here.
Yes, sir.
But, you know, there are more than 50 years all total. And maybe there'll be another time, another occasion, another place to talk about more.
Well, you are a force, and I think that we are responsible, though not for the ways in which our history has been disrupted, we are responsible for being stewards of that history. Mm-hmm. And I greatly appreciate your storytelling and your time. And I want you to know how appreciated you are in the fabric of this history. So.
Well, let me say that it does me good every now and then, ever so often, to encounter people who are interested in listening to what an old man has to say.
I'll always be interested. Well, thank you so much for your time.